In the summer of 1837, Washington, D.C. stood as a city divided between ideals and institutions. The marble buildings of Congress gleamed in the sunlight, monuments to liberty and progress. Yet only streets away, human lives were traded as property. The air was thick, not only with heat and humidity, but with the unspoken contradictions of a nation that preached freedom while perpetuating bondage. Amid this uneasy balance lived Dorcas Allen, an enslaved woman whose story would soon disturb the conscience of an entire city. Dorcas was known among locals as quiet, dutiful, and fiercely protective of her two children. They were described in records as mulatto, a cruel label that spoke to the blurred lines of power and exploitation that defined so many families in bondage. When her owner announced plans to sell her children separately, one to Virginia, the other to Louisiana, Dorcas faced an impossible choice. Within the confined logic of her existence, love and loss became indistinguishable. And on one unbearable August afternoon, she did the unthinkable. She ended their lives with her own hands. When she was found, Dorcas did not flee. Neighbors recalled her sitting still, the children's bodies arranged carefully beside her. Her only words, barely audible, were, "They are safe now." That sentence would echo through Washington's courts, churches, and newspapers, igniting a firestorm of outrage, pity, and fear. Was this woman a murderer, or a mother pushed beyond the limits of human endurance? Her trial became one of the most controversial legal proceedings of the antebellum era. Journalists called it the case of the weeping nation, while preachers used it as proof of sin and spiritual decay. Abolitionists, however, saw something different. They saw Dorcas not as a monster, but as a symptom of a monstrous system, one that tore families apart with impunity and left mothers to make choices no human heart could bear. The story of Dorcas Allen is not merely a record of violence. It is a psychological descent into the fractured mind of a woman stripped of agency, identity, and hope. Through her, we confront the intersection of morality and madness, religion and despair. She forces us to ask, when every road leads to suffering, can mercy take a form that defies morality? This documentary will retrace her path through courtroom testimonies, forgotten archives, and witness accounts, unraveling how one act, both incomprehensible and inevitable, became a mirror for America's divided soul. Each fragment of her story reveals a society desperate to rationalize the irrational, to find meaning in an act that was, perhaps, the ultimate protest against dehumanization. In Dorcas's whisper, "They are safe now," lies both horror and grace. Her story is not about cruelty alone, but about the haunting psychology of love distorted by bondage. Nearly 2 centuries later, her name remains a question whispered through history. Was Dorcas Allen a killer, a victim, or the embodiment of a truth too unbearable for her time to face? The year was 1837, and Washington, D.C. stood at the uneasy crossroads of power and paradox. On the steps of the Capitol, senators spoke eloquently about liberty and divine providence, while in the nearby alleys and market squares, human lives were bought and sold with the same detachment reserved for livestock. The city, newly polished and expanding, represented both the dream and the hypocrisy of a nation unwilling to face its own reflection. Within this tension, between progress and cruelty, lived Dorcas Allen, an enslaved woman whose existence unfolded in the shadows of American freedom. Dorcas belonged to the family of Reverend Josiah Fisher, a respected clergyman and moral reformer whose sermons often invoked mercy and righteousness. Yet within the quiet confines of his household, Dorcas labored not as a parishioner, but as property. The Fisher residence stood near Pennsylvania Avenue, elegant and orderly, with its wide porches and polished pewter. To the public eye, it was a home of virtue and discipline. But beneath that facade, the rhythms of bondage persisted, the unseen footsteps of those who rose before dawn, who cooked, cleaned, nursed, and endured in silence. Dorcas's world was one of contradictions. Each Sunday, she dressed the Fisher children for church, listening as hymns of deliverance filled the air. She stood at the back of the sanctuary, near the vestibule reserved for colored servants, and mouthed the words, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Meekness, in her case, was not a choice but a condition. She understood the fragile balance of survival, the tone of voice that must remain soft, the gaze that must lower, the will that must bend but never break. Yet beneath her composure stirred a mind both observant and fiercely maternal, shaped by the dual forces of faith and fear. Historical fragments paint a sparse but telling picture of her life. Census documents list her as female mulatto, aged approximately 28. and a household ledger records the birth of 2 children, noted only as issue of Dorcas. Their father's name predictably is absent. Such omissions were common, masking generations of exploitation under the pretense of propriety. To the white world, Dorcas was invisible. To her children, she was everything. The Fisher family, like many of their class, oscillated between acts of kindness and cruelty. At times, Dorcas was permitted minor freedoms, a walk to the Sunday market, the right to attend evening prayer meetings organized by the local African Methodist Episcopal Church. These fleeting liberties formed the fragile scaffolding of her inner life, small illusions of autonomy that made survival bearable. But they also heightened her awareness of captivity. Each taste of freedom reminded her of what she did not possess. In 1835, when Reverend Fisher accepted a temporary position in New Jersey, a state that had begun gradual emancipation, Dorcas's world shifted. For the first time, she stepped onto soil where slavery was technically illegal. Neighbors recalled her cautious joy, her whispered prayers of gratitude. Under New Jersey law, she and her children were free. For nearly 2 years, she worked for modest wages, saving what little she could, dreaming of permanence. But freedom in that era was never secure. It was conditional, reversible, and fragile as glass. When the Fishers decided to return to Washington, Dorcas's hope collapsed. Legally, her freedom vanished the moment her feet crossed back into the district's jurisdiction. She and her children were once again property, bound to the same house that had once been her prison. That re-enslavement, sanctioned by law and faith alike, marked the beginning of her psychological descent. Contemporary scholars have described the mental toll of such reversals as cognitive suffocation, a slow erosion of will that comes when hope is given, then violently revoked. Letters from abolitionist observers like Lydia Maria Child describe women who walk as though between 2 worlds, neither slave nor free, alive yet spiritually extinguished. Dorcas's re-enslavement was not just a legal event, it was a spiritual execution. Inside the Fisher household, the children she had birthed under northern skies were now marked for sale. The domestic economy of the South relied heavily on such internal trade, where infants and toddlers were sold to settle debts or reward favors. Dorcas overheard the plans one evening through the thin boards of the kitchen wall. One child to a family in Virginia, the other bound for Louisiana. For a mother, that meant something worse than death. It meant dismemberment of the soul. The fear of separation haunted enslaved families more than any whip or chain. Frederick Douglass later wrote, "The slave mother lives not for herself, but in trembling expectation of loss. To the enslaved, love was both salvation and curse, for every attachment became a potential wound." Dorcas's every gesture, feeding, washing, teaching her children to pray, was shadowed by the knowledge that each moment might be the last she would spend with them. Yet within that anguish her faith remained, though twisted by suffering. She prayed nightly for deliverance, whispering psalms beneath her breath, even as the scriptures around her were used to justify her bondage. "Servants, obey your masters," the reverend intoned from the pulpit, never questioning the moral dissonance of a faith that sanctified cruelty. Dorcas internalized both halves of that contradiction, the voice of submission and the cry for salvation. The tension between those forces, moral and maternal, would soon erupt into a single, incomprehensible act. The daily routines of the Fisher estate concealed 1,000 silent struggles. The scent of soap and lye in the washroom, the rhythmic creak of the iron press, the hum of distant hymns, all formed the sensory architecture of her captivity. The other servants whispered their own stories. One woman beaten for defiance, another sold after childbirth. Among them, Dorcas was respected, even revered for her quiet strength. Yet that very strength concealed a growing fracture within. Modern psychologists examining her case through historical records describe learned helplessness intertwined with moral inversion. When systems of domination become absolute, the mind seeks agency wherever it can find it, even in destruction. For Dorcas, whose children's lives were no longer her own, the act of taking them may have felt like a reclamation of that agency, a way to shield them from an existence she knew too well. Her whispered words, "They are safe now," were not the utterance of madness alone, but of a logic built in torment. The world that shaped Dorcas Allen was not defined merely by laws or chains, but by a network of contradictions, Christian compassion entwined with racial cruelty, domestic warmth built on coerced labor, public morality coexisting with private violation. In that world, even love became suspect, contaminated by power. Every motherly instinct she possessed was weaponized against her, used to keep her compliant, obedient, and bound. Yet within that same world, resistance took many forms. Some fled through the Underground Railroad. Others rebelled silently through small refusals, broken tools, delayed tasks, hidden messages. Dorcas's rebellion was not physical but psychological. It took root in her understanding of a universe that offered no justice. To her, salvation could not be found in the courts or the church, only in an act that transcended comprehension. To reconstruct Dorcas's world is to enter a psychological labyrinth where morality and madness become indistinguishable. Every factor, the revivalist sermons, the proximity of freedom, the rhythm of captivity, converged into a singular pressure point. Her story does not exist in isolation. It reflects the collective trauma of thousands of enslaved mothers who faced the same impossible calculus. She simply reached a breaking point where thought gave way to action, where endurance turned to defiance. In the months before the tragedy, witnesses described subtle changes in her demeanor. She stopped singing while she worked. Her eyes lingered too long on her children as they slept. She spoke less, prayed more. One neighbor, a washerwoman named Ruth Collins, later told reporters, "It was as if she was already halfway gone, living, but not among us." That quiet withdrawal was the final stage of a psychological spiral centuries in the making. The world of Dorcas Allen was thus not a single place, but a collision of forces, economic, spiritual, emotional, all conspiring toward a single tragic moment. It was a world that demanded obedience while denying humanity, that celebrated morality while practicing cruelty, that defined motherhood as sacred, but stripped mothers of their children. When we peer into that world, we do not find monsters or saints. We find the unbearable tension of human beings crushed between belief and brutality. Dorcas's story begins there, in that fragile space between bondage and hope, silence and scream. Her actions, unfathomable as they seem, emerged from a world meticulously designed to break her spirit. To understand her is not to excuse, but to confront the society that created her despair. Before the courtrooms, the headlines, and the whispered condemnations, there was simply a woman, a mother, trying to navigate a world where love itself had become a crime. The summer of 1837 in Washington, D.C. was suffocating, thick air clinging to skin, heat rising from cobblestones like the breath of an unseen beast. The city sweltered under the illusion of progress, but beneath the grandeur of its marble facades lay rot, moral, spiritual, and human. That August, the heat was not the only thing pressing down. Something else, an invisible weight, seemed to suffuse the small servant quarters behind Reverend Josiah Fisher's grand home. It was here, in the stifling shadow of the kitchen yard, that Dorcas Allen committed an act so incomprehensible it would fracture the city's conscience and ignite one of the earliest moral debates linking race, psychology, and faith. The day began unremarkably. The Fishers were away visiting parishioners, leaving Dorcas to tend to her duties. Neighbors later recalled seeing her drawing water from the well, her movements deliberate, her gaze vacant. The children, Sarah, age 6, and Thomas, just 4, played nearby, their laughter mingling with the cries of market hawkers from across the avenue. It was an ordinary domestic tableau, a mother, her children, the afternoon sun suspended in quiet domestic rhythm. Yet something in the air that day felt strained, as if the world itself were holding its breath. What happened next was pieced together from fragmented testimony, gossip, and Dorcas's own unsettling calmness. Sometime after noon, she led the children to the small patch of shade behind the servant quarters, a place hidden from the main house by a stack of firewood and the laundry lines. One witness, Ruth Collins, the same washerwoman who had once spoken kindly of her, told investigators she heard singing. Not hymns, but a lullaby, soft, rhythmic, and strangely tender. The melody drifted through the heat, mingling with the buzzing of flies and the far-off sound of a church bell marking the hour. Then came silence. Minutes later, Collins saw Dorcas emerge, her white apron streaked with red. She walked, not ran, toward the back steps of the Fisher house. She wasn't crying, Collins later told the National Intelligencer. Her face was empty, like a candle burnt out. When asked what had happened, Dorcas reportedly said only 4 words: "They are safe now." Behind the quarters, neighbors found the children's bodies laid side by side, their heads resting on folded cloth as though prepared for sleep. There were no signs of struggle. Their faces, witnesses said, appeared peaceful, an image that would haunt Washington for months to come. Physicians called to the scene confirmed that the cause of death was strangulation, though the mark suggested a careful, deliberate pressure rather than rage. It was, one doctor wrote, an act of dreadful tenderness. Within hours, the story spread. The local press descended on the Fisher estate, hungry for details. The Washington Globe framed the incident as a spectacle of savage depravity, while the Christian Advocate warned that Satan had walked among the colored servants of the city. Yet others, particularly the abolitionist papers circulating in northern cities, interpreted it differently. The Liberator ran a piece headlined, "A Mother's Despair. When freedom is denied, death becomes deliverance." The story split public opinion along moral, racial, and theological lines, each faction seeking meaning in a deed that seemed to reject meaning itself. Dorcas was arrested that evening. When constables entered the servant quarters, they found her sitting on the edge of her straw mattress, blood dried on her dress, her hands folded in her lap. She did not resist. When asked why she had done it, she looked up with a faint, almost polite sadness and whispered, "They would have been taken." The interrogator pressed further. "Taken where?" "By whom?" She answered only, "To where no mother can follow." Her confession, recorded by court scribes and reprinted in broadsheets, became the moral epicenter of the tragedy. It was neither denial nor justification, but a statement of unbearable conviction. To those who saw her as monstrous, her composure was proof of insanity. To those who understood the machinery of slavery, it was the last expression of maternal love under impossible conditions. The preliminary hearing was held at the city jail on Judiciary Square, a grim structure that echoed with prayers and curses from its narrow cells. There, Dorcas sat before a panel of magistrates, her wrists bound loosely, her eyes vacant but alert. The attending physician, Dr. Samuel Worthington, described her demeanor in his report. She responds to all questions rationally but without effect. When shown the children's garments, she touches them gently and says, "They were mine." Her pulse remains steady. "I suspect moral derangement rather than madness." Moral derangement, a term that would later evolve into moral insanity, was a new and controversial idea in early American psychiatry. It proposed that one could remain intellectually sound while morally disordered, capable of reason yet divorced from empathy or restraint. In Dorcas's case, however, the concept blurred the lines between sanity and suffering. Did her act emerge from delusion, despair, or a distorted sense of salvation? The court, the clergy, and the public each supplied their own answers. From the pulpit, Reverend Fisher thundered that evil had entered his home through the guise of servitude. "The devil," he proclaimed, "finds fertile ground in those who reject obedience." Yet privately, according to fragments from his diary, Fisher was shaken. "If she is possessed," he wrote, "then the blame lies also with those who gave the demon a place to dwell." That unguarded admission, never printed publicly, revealed a conscience gnawing at the edges of piety. Meanwhile, in the emerging abolitionist circles, Dorcas's name became a rallying cry. Pamphlets circulated describing her as a mother crucified by the laws of men. Writers like Sarah Grimke and Angelina Weld invoked her case as evidence that slavery corrupted not only the enslaved, but the moral fabric of the nation. "If a mother," Grimke wrote, "must choose between the auction block and the grave, the crime is not hers, but ours." Yet not everyone accepted that framing. The Evening Star published lurid illustrations of Dorcas with exaggerated features, labeling her the she-wolf of Washington. The image sold thousands of copies. Public fascination with her calmness, her absence of visible remorse, turned her into both monster and martyr. Audiences wanted to be horrified but also to understand. How could a woman who nursed, prayed, and served commit such a quiet atrocity? In her cell, Dorcas rarely spoke. Guards described her as peaceful to the point of unnatural. Each morning she asked for water to wash her hands and face, then sat by the narrow window, whispering hymns under her breath. On the third day, when a preacher visited to extract repentance, she said, "There is nothing to forgive. I sent them to where the Lord will not let them be sold." This statement, recorded verbatim in the chaplain's notes, became the cornerstone of debates in both theological and medical journals. To some, it signified demonic delusion, a belief that God had sanctioned the destruction of innocence. To others, it revealed an inverted faith born of relentless suffering, where divine mercy could only exist in death. The trial that followed was swift but contentious. Because enslaved individuals could not testify on equal footing with whites, Much of the evidence came secondhand, from the Fishers, from neighbors, from the medical examiner. The defense, led by a young attorney sympathetic to abolitionist ideals, argued temporary insanity, brought on by maternal anguish and religious delusion. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating murderer. Court transcripts capture the tension vividly. When the prosecutor demanded to know whether she regretted her actions, Dorcas replied, "Regret is for those who have choices." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge paused before striking his gavel. Those words would later appear in abolitionist tracts as a haunting summary of the enslaved condition. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Vendors sold penny pamphlets detailing every rumor, claims of voodoo, of spells, of whispered prophecies. Religious leaders staged public prayers for the cleansing of a defiled city. Meanwhile, journalists turned her into a symbol of whatever cause they served: madness, motherhood, evil, or emancipation. Few paused to see her as human. Among the evidence presented was a letter found among her belongings, unsigned, written in uneven script. It read, "If I cannot free them in life, may the Lord take them in mercy." Whether Dorcas herself wrote it remains uncertain, but its sentiment echoed her final confession. For the court, the letter proved premeditation. For historians, it remains a document of unbearable clarity, a statement of impossible love. The verdict, though expected, did not end the debate. Dorcas was declared guilty but insane at the time of the act, and thus spared execution. Instead, she was remanded to the Washington City Asylum, where she would spend the remainder of her life in relative obscurity. But even there, her story refused to die. Visitors reported that she continued to speak softly to herself, rocking as if cradling an invisible child. When asked what she was saying, one attendant recalled her words, "They sleep in light." From that phrase grew a legend. For years afterward, rumors spread of ghostly lullabies heard near the old Fisher estate, of a woman's voice humming through the summer heat. Some dismissed them as superstition. Others saw them as echoes of guilt that the city itself could not silence. In the decades that followed, Dorcas Allen's crime became a touchstone for early American discussions of insanity, race, and motherhood. Her calm confession haunted both medical journals and abolitionist literature. To physicians, she was an enigma, a subject illustrating the new nebulous frontier between mental illness and moral despair. To reformers, she was proof that slavery produced conditions so cruel they could warp even maternal love into self-destruction. What the record makes clear is this: the act was neither sudden nor senseless. It was the culmination of years of psychological suffocation, the final assertion of power by a woman to whom the world had left none. Her confession, simple, unwavering, and devoid of drama, was not a plea for forgiveness but an indictment of the world itself. The tragedy of Dorcas Allen is that her voice, calm as it was, became a vessel for everyone else's fears and agendas. No one truly heard her. They heard what they needed to believe. Some saw a monster, others a martyr. Yet in the center of those competing narratives stood a woman who believed, perhaps with terrible clarity, that she had saved her children. And so the summer heat of 1837 passed, but the moral fever it unleashed did not. Washington's streets cooled, the papers moved on, and the Fisher family faded into history. But the words "they are safe now" lingered, in sermons, in psychiatric lectures, in abolitionist speeches, as both confession and curse. For in uttering them, Dorcas Allen forced a nation to confront its most unanswerable question: what happens to love in a world that makes love impossible? The trial of Dorcas Allen in the autumn of 1837 became one of the earliest moral earthquakes in the history of Washington, D.C., a proceeding that revealed not only the brutality of slavery, but the fragility of justice itself. The Capitol, still steeped in Southern codes of property and hierarchy, trembled under the weight of her crime. The murder of 2 children was ghastly enough, but what made the case truly unbearable was that the accused was a mother, and an enslaved mother at that, someone whose very motherhood was denied by law. What unfolded inside that small courthouse on Judiciary Square was more than a legal trial. It was an autopsy of conscience, peeling back the skin of a nation to expose what lay beneath. Every morning the courtroom overflowed with spectators. White socialites arrived draped in silk and moral outrage, their fans fluttering like nervous wings. Ministers came seeking divine explanation. Journalists scribbled furiously, hoping to capture the face of evil or of innocence. At the back, pressed against the walls, stood free black men and women, and even a few enslaved servants, who risked their master's wrath to glimpse what some called the woman who defied both God and master. The air was thick, humid, and fevered. No one was quite sure what they were witnessing, justice, tragedy, or something far darker. The prosecution opened its case with icy precision. District Attorney Harlan Mason wasted no time in painting Dorcas as a deliberate, calculating murderer. He argued that she had acted out of vengeance, not despair. She destroyed not only the fruit of her womb, he thundered, but the rightful property of her master. His words chilled the courtroom, cold reminders of the world Dorcas inhabited, where her children were counted not as lives, but as assets. To him, her motive was not mercy but rebellion. She struck not at her children's bondage, Mason declared, but at the order of our civilization itself. But the defense, led by attorney William Bain, offered a radical counterpoint. Bain, a lawyer with quiet abolitionist sympathies, took the case at great personal risk. His argument was both daring and humane, that Dorcas Allen was not in her right mind, that slavery itself had driven her beyond the limits of reason. Drawing from the emerging theories of moral insanity circulating in European medicine, Bain argued that her act was the symptom of a broken system, a moral injury inflicted by years of captivity and maternal terror. You may call her mad, he said, his voice trembling with passion, but ask yourselves, who built the cage that made madness her only escape? The prosecution scoffed, dismissing the defense's claims as sentimental nonsense. But Bain persisted, calling witnesses whose words would cut through the courtroom like knives. Sarah Kemp, the white housekeeper of the Allen household, testified that Dorcas had always been gentle, obedient, and faithful, a woman who kept to herself and sang softly while working. On the day of the killings, Kemp recalled hearing a hymn, a lullaby barely audible, drifting from the servants' quarters. Moments later came the scream. When she arrived, the scene was eerily quiet. The two children lay motionless, their faces peaceful, as if they were merely asleep. Dorcas sat beside them, rocking, humming the same hymn, blood on her hands and calm in her eyes. She said only one thing, Kemp whispered to the court. She said, "They are safe now." The room erupted into whispers. Some crossed themselves. Others looked away. The prosecution attempted to interpret Dorcas's calm as proof of evil deliberation, but to many, it sounded like the broken echo of a mother who had lost everything. When medical experts took the stand, the courtroom transformed into a battleground between science and morality. Dr. Elijah Warren, a young physician fascinated by the study of the mind, testified that Dorcas exhibited signs of what was then called moral insanity, a condition where emotion, not intellect, was diseased. She reasoned clearly, he told the court, but reasoned from a heart twisted by bondage and despair. Hers is not the madness of frenzy, but of sorrow. Another doctor, Samuel Keene, vehemently disagreed. This is no madness, he spat. She acted from hopelessness, not hallucination. Despair is not disease. The two physicians argued openly before the jury, their debate a microcosm of America's own confusion. Was slavery a moral question? A medical one or something far more insidious? Outside the courthouse, pamphlets flooded the city. Preachers thundered from their pulpits that the devil himself had seized Dorcas's hand. Abolitionists countered that her act was the natural result of a system that tore mothers from children and then called their grief unnatural. The New York Spectator wrote that her crime was born from a nation's sin, while the Richmond Courier warned that to pity her is to excuse rebellion. The Idouard case ceased to be about Dorcas Allen and became a referendum on the soul of America itself. Inside the courtroom, however, Dorcas remained still. She did not weep. She did not plead. When asked why she did it, she simply replied, "I could not see them taken." 6 words, neither defense nor denial, but an unanswerable truth. Even her lawyer seemed shaken. "Did you think," he asked her gently, "that God would forgive you?" She looked at him for a long time before replying, "God forgives where man cannot." The newspapers seized on that line. Some printed it as proof of delusion, others as a sermon. But for those who stood in that courtroom, it became something else entirely. A haunting mirror held up to a society that had forced a mother to choose between her faith and her flesh. When Colonel William Allen, her master, took the stand, the room fell into a silence so deep it seemed to hum. He described Dorcas as faithful and affectionate toward her children, He spoke of her obedience, her skill, her quietness. When asked by the defense whether he had ever threatened to sell her children, his tone faltered. There were discussions, he admitted, but no decisions. Bain pressed harder. Did she know of these discussions? After a pause, the colonel replied coldly, it was not her place to know. That moment cracked the trial open. Every person in that courtroom understood instantly. She had known. She had known because every enslaved mother lived beneath the constant shadow of separation. To the law, her children were property. To her, they were breath and heartbeat. When she saw the sale approaching, perhaps she saw something worse than death. She saw forgetting. The jury listened, silent and pale. The defense rested its case with a single sentence. You cannot judge her without judging the world that made her. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that stunned the Capitol. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Some gasped in outrage, others in awe. Dorcas herself made no sound. She bowed her head and whispered something under her breath. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a farewell. But freedom did not follow. The verdict, unprecedented in a slave case, confused even the legal clerks. Because she was considered property, acquittal did not mean release. It meant she reverted to ownership. Her attorney petitioned for mercy, and her master, fearful of public scandal, agreed to commit her instead to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, one of America's earliest asylums. Records describe Dorcas in her final years as docile, contemplative, inclined to prayer. No further mention appears in the hospital ledgers after 1842. Some believe she died there quietly. Others insist she was sold once more, her identity erased, her story left to drift through rumor and half-remembered sermons. Yet the echoes of her trial endured. Historians would later call it the first American case to test the intersection of slavery, insanity, and the law. For the first time, a court had entertained the notion that madness could be born not from biology, but from cruelty. That a person could go insane not because of who they were, but because of what had been done to them. For abolitionists, Dorcas became a symbol of slavery's ultimate contradiction, a system that forced love to become an act of rebellion. To theologians, she represented the collapse of moral order. To early psychologists, she was a case study in trauma before the word existed. But to those who heard her name whispered in the dark, she remained something else entirely, a reminder that beneath every law lies a human heart, and that sometimes the heart breaks in ways no law can understand. Dorcas Allen's trial forced America to look into a mirror it had long avoided. Her crime was monstrous, but the world that birthed it was perhaps more so. As one abolitionist preacher wrote years later, if she was mad, then let us confess, it was we who drove her to it. The verdict, the outrage, the sermons, all faded with time. But one question still lingers, echoing like a ghost in the nation's conscience. If Dorcas Allen was mad for killing her children, then what name do we give the world that made her choose? When the century turned and the Civil War had come and gone, the name Dorcas Allen was almost erased from public memory. Yet in the corners of kitchens, in the soft gatherings of freedwomen and their daughters, her story refused to die. It became something whispered rather than spoken aloud, half caution, half prayer. What had once been printed in the Washington Intelligencer as a tale of female depravity found new life as an unrecorded folk memory, reshaped by those who saw not madness, but unbearable love. Over time, Dorcas ceased to belong to history alone. She entered the uneasy space between fact and myth, where suffering becomes symbol and truth becomes reflection. In the small communities of freed blacks that rose along the outskirts of Washington and Maryland after emancipation, old women still spoke her name in hushed tones. The mother who set her babies free, they would say, as if invoking both mercy and mourning. Her story traveled with migrating families, north to Philadelphia, west to Ohio, gaining shape with each retelling. Sometimes she was said to have sung as she worked. Sometimes, that her voice could still be heard in the night winds near the old courthouse. Each generation altered her tale, but the emotional core remained the same. A mother crushed by a world that denied her every choice except the one that damned her. For African American storytellers, Dorcas Allen became both ghost and guide. In church sermons, particularly within the hidden worship circles of the Reconstruction South, she appeared as a paradoxical saint, one who had sinned beyond forgiveness yet was still worthy of grace. Preachers warned that hers was not a story to glorify but to understand. She was driven to the edge, one pastor declared in an 1874 sermon in Baltimore, And when the world offered no door, she broke the wall. The congregation reportedly sat silent, some weeping, as the preacher closed by saying, "May we not blame her but the stone that built her prison." Spirituals, too, began to echo fragments of her legend. In one variant of the song, Mother Gone Free, collected by folklorist J.A. Holloway in 1902, the refrain mourns, "She took her young to Jordan's tide. She wept, she prayed, they slept, they died. No chains, no tears, no master's cry. The Lord has set her children high." To the untrained ear, it was simply another sorrowful spiritual, but within its verses lived coded meaning, a merging of biblical imagery and historical memory. For enslaved and later emancipated listeners, Jordan's tide was freedom, and sleep was the only peace that bondage could not steal. The song transformed Dorcas's act from a crime into a lamentation, a symbolic ritual of release. Among white audiences, however, the narrative shifted toward moral instruction and fear. Southern newspapers, even decades after her death, occasionally resurrected the tale to warn of the dangers of Negro emotion and the hysteria of unchained womanhood. To them, Dorcas was not a victim but a prophecy, a symbol of what happens when order collapses. In one particularly venomous article from 1889, published in the Richmond Herald, a columnist sneered, "Once freed from the moral guidance of their masters, they revert to madness. Her tragedy, stripped of humanity, became propaganda." In contrast, Northern abolitionist writers of the post-war years reimagined Dorcas as a martyr of conscience. Lydia Maria Child, a prominent humanitarian and essayist, alluded to a mother in bondage who chose heaven over separation in her unpublished journals. Child never used Dorcas's name, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Later reformers cited the case as proof that slavery's evil extended beyond the lash, that it corrupted the moral logic of both enslaved and enslaver. For them, Dorcas embodied the unbearable truth that even love under tyranny could turn lethal. By the early 20th century, as psychology emerged as a modern discipline, her story found yet another reincarnation, this time in the academic lexicon of trauma. Psychiatrist Dr. Althea Copeland, one of the first black women to publish in American medical journals, referenced Dorcas in her 1928 paper, Inherited Sorrow, The Mental Residue of Enslavement. Copeland argued that the moral collapse evident in Allen's act was not madness in isolation, but the predictable fracture of a mind. Crushed between love and ownership, she described how the children of enslaved women often became extensions of their own trauma, symbols of hope and terror intertwined. To kill them, she wrote, was to kill what the world had made of them, not what they were. Psychological reinterpretations continued throughout the 20th century. In the 1960s, civil rights-era scholars revisited her story as part of the hidden narratives of black womanhood. Historian Dr. Viola Reeves noted in her seminal book, Bound Mothers, Silent Tombs That Dorcas Allen Represented, the unbearable arithmetic of enslavement, where love multiplies pain and freedom subtracts reason. Reeves traced how women under slavery internalized the omnipresent threat of separation, living in constant fear that their children could be sold or whipped beyond recognition. In that psychological terrain, she argued, Dorcas's act, while unforgivable, became tragically comprehensible. Meanwhile, artists began to resurrect Dorcas from the margins. In 1974, playwright Miriam DeShields premiered Safe Now, a haunting one-act monologue in which Dorcas's spirit speaks from within an asylum cell. The play's refrain, "I did not kill them, I set them free," revived public interest in the historical figure and reframed her as a complex symbol of resistance. Critics debated whether the play romanticized her or humanized her, but audiences left in silence, shaken by the moral dissonance it presented. DeShields later said she wrote the piece not to excuse Dorcas, but to give madness a name that sounds like love. Within African American communities, Dorcas's story continued to evolve as both inheritance and warning. In the segregated classrooms of the 1940s, some teachers whispered her name in lessons on courage and despair. To them, she represented the invisible weight of generational trauma, the knowledge that some forms of captivity survive long after the chains are gone. Mothers, particularly those descended from enslaved families, told her story differently. They spoke not of crime but of desperation, of the thin line between sacrifice and sin. She didn't want them hurt, one elderly woman recalled in a 1979 oral history. Maybe she thought heaven was the only home left. Religious communities, too, wrestled with her memory. In some black churches, she was invoked during Mother's Day services, not by name, but by symbol. To every mother who's ever had to choose between her soul and her survival, preachers would say, "We remember you." The congregation would hum softly, the echo of Mother Gone Free weaving through the sanctuary. Yet outside these intimate circles, Dorcas remained largely invisible to mainstream history. Textbooks omitted her, preferring the more palatable narratives of rebellion and emancipation. It wasn't until the late 20th century that academic historians began to reclaim her story, not as legend but as a case study in what they termed psychological enslavement. They viewed her as a woman trapped in a paradox, taught that obedience was virtue, yet forced to confront that obedience meant the destruction of her children. In recent decades, the legend has resurfaced in digital spaces, rediscovered by historians, artists, and online communities fascinated by the blurred line between madness and meaning. Social media threads debate whether Dorcas Allen was a murderer or a martyr. Documentaries and true crime podcasts reference her case as an early example of maternal trauma under captivity. One viral tweet quoted her alleged final words, "They are safe now," sparking thousands of comments that split evenly between horror and empathy. And perhaps that is where her myth has always lived, in the tension between condemnation and compassion. Every retelling reflects not only the storyteller, but the era in which it is told. To Reconstruction-era Freedmen, she was a mother broken by chains. To Victorian moralists, she was a warning. To civil rights activists, she was the echo of injustice. To psychologists, she is a patient history could not diagnose. Each generation built its own mirror, and in Dorcas's reflection, they saw themselves. Even within her contradictions, the legend continues to evolve. Some versions claim that her ghost lingers near St. Elizabeth's Hospital, walking the halls where she once prayed. Staff in the early 1900s reportedly spoke of hearing lullabies in empty wards, soft, rhythmic, impossibly sad. Others say that on humid August nights, when the Potomac air grows heavy, the faint cry of a woman calling two children's names can still be heard drifting from the old asylum grounds. Rational minds dismiss it as folklore, but for those who know her story, it feels less like haunting and more like endurance. Scholars of memory argue that stories like Dorcas Allen's survive precisely because they cannot be neatly categorized. They live in contradiction, in the spaces where morality and madness overlap. Collective memory, writes cultural theorist Henry Alcott, feeds on ambiguity. When an act is both unforgivable and understandable, it endures forever. Dorcas's story, like the silver cup of another legend or the bell that never stopped tolling, remains unfinished. It refuses closure because closure would mean absolution, and no one, neither Dorcas nor her society, has earned that. Her myth reminds us that history does not only record facts, it records feelings. In the songs and sermons, in the silence between words, lies the emotional residue of centuries. Each retelling of Dorcas Allen is an act of both remembrance and revision, a struggle to reconcile love's most terrible expression with the cruelty that made it possible. And so the story continues to travel. In graduate seminars, in church basements, in whispered bedtime warnings, Dorcas's name reappears. Half ghost, half gospel. Every generation must decide who she was, a mother lost to madness, or a soul who saw what others could not bear to see. Perhaps that is the final truth her legend teaches, that memory is not about what happened, but about what we need to believe happened. In that belief, fragile, haunting, and unresolved, Dorcas Allen lives on, not as history's victim or villain, but as its echo. In the long aftermath of Dorcas Allen's act, the world she left behind became divided not just by race or creed, but by interpretation. Every generation that looked upon her story saw a different reflection. Some saw a monster, others a martyr, and still others a mirror held up to the brutal face of a nation that demanded moral order while living on moral contradiction. Theories grew like ivy around the ruins of her name, wrapping themselves in psychology, theology, law, and collective guilt. To understand Dorcas Allen, one must sift through these interpretations not as competing answers, but as fragments of a single shattered consciousness, the consciousness of America itself in the age of slavery. The first theory emerged almost immediately after her trial, that Dorcas Allen acted out of maternal despair, a psychological rupture born from the terror of losing her children to the slave trade. Early abolitionist writers like Lydia Maria Child and Samuel May seized upon this reading as proof that slavery itself could twist natural love into unnatural action. She killed them, one pamphlet read, because she knew that the world would kill them more slowly. For these early reformers, Dorcas's act was not an aberration, but an exposure, an unmasking of a system so cruel that it forced mothers to commit the unthinkable to spare their children the inevitable. They wrote of her as a tragic saint of the shadowed South, a woman whose crime was her only possible mercy. In their retellings, her whispered words, "They are safe now," became a prayer, not a confession. Yet even among abolitionists, unease lingered. Was it right to sanctify murder in the name of freedom? Could moral horror be redeemed by context? Some argued that her mind must have broken, that she was possessed by grief, incapable of moral reasoning. This interpretation opened a different door, the door of psychology, which was only just beginning to find its vocabulary in the 19th century. Doctors like Mariah Brigham and Isaac Ray, both pioneers in American psychiatry, referenced Dorcas Allen's case in their early writings on moral insanity. They described it as a disorder of the affections, in which reason remained intact, but the emotions became deranged. The afflicted, they argued, could distinguish right from wrong in theory, yet act against both out of a disordered moral feeling. Dorcas's calm demeanor, her lucid confession, her serene explanation, all suggested not madness in the mind, but madness in the heart. To the medical men of the day, this was both terrifying and fascinating, that an enslaved woman, denied education, could embody the very paradox that confounded emerging psychiatry. She was neither hysterical nor deranged. She was deliberate, articulate, and sincere in her conviction that death was deliverance. Her composure contradicted every racist assumption about the supposed irrationality of the enslaved. For physicians, she was a case study in moral pathology. For theologians, she was evidence of demonic influence. For her contemporaries, she was a wound that refused to close. Religious interpretations multiplied in the pulpits of Washington and beyond. Ministers thundered that she had yielded to the serpent's whisper, choosing despair over divine providence. They likened her to Judas, driven by remorse but condemned by choice. Yet among black preachers, a different theology emerged, one rooted in the lived experience of bondage. They read her act through the book of Exodus, not Genesis. Dorcas was not Judas, they said. She was Moses' mother, Jochebed, who placed her infant in the river rather than surrender him to Pharaoh's slaughter. Only Dorcas had no river, no basket, no hope of survival. Her only vessel of deliverance was death itself. Thus, the moral weight of her action shifted. It was not sin alone, but sacrifice. Within certain spiritual communities, her name became a whispered invocation, half caution, half lament. By the time of the Civil War, Dorcas Allen had become both symbol and specter. Northern newspapers invoked her memory to illustrate the psychological toll of slavery, while Southern presses condemned abolitionists for turning a murderer into a martyr. In sermons and pamphlets, she was alternately described as the woman who defied God's law and the mother who freed her children's souls. The duality was complete. Dorcas had become two women, one damned, one sanctified, and both interpretations served the moral agendas of their interpreters. In the 20th century, as psychology matured and America began to reckon with the legacies of racial trauma, Dorcas Allen's story resurfaced in academic circles. Theories of trauma, dissociation, and intergenerational memory reframed her act within the language of survival. Psychologists studying post-slavery emotional inheritance noted how persistent stress and fear could alter cognition itself, how those forced to live in constant threat developed distorted survival mechanisms. Within this framework, Dorcas's decision was neither moral nor immoral. It was the desperate logic of a mind trapped between terror and love. To some, it was an early example of what would later be called psychological resistance, a refusal to submit to a system that claimed ownership over her body and her children's souls. Killing them was, paradoxically, the only act still under her control. The gesture was horrific, but in that horror lay a grim assertion of agency. Feminist historians expanded this interpretation further. They saw in Dorcas Allen's story not only the trauma of race, but the compounded suffering of gender. Enslaved women were denied not just freedom, but motherhood itself. Their children could be sold at any time, their bodies commodified, their families dismantled by law. Within that structure, the act of killing one's own children was not rebellion against morality, but against ownership. Scholars like Angela Davis and Saidiya Hartman, writing about the politics of black motherhood, later invoked similar cases to illustrate how slavery weaponized love, how it turned nurturing into vulnerability, and attachment into agony. In this context, Dorcas Allen's act becomes legible as an extreme, distorted form of reclamation. If I cannot keep them as mine in life, I will keep them in death. It was, in a devastating sense, the only power left to her. But other historians resist this sympathetic framing, warning that moralizing or psychologizing Dorcas Allen risks erasing the sheer horror of her choice. To them, the tragedy must remain raw, a reminder that even the oppressed can commit unforgivable acts. They argue that to sanctify her is to diminish the innocence of her children, whose voices have been lost in the retelling. These scholars place emphasis on accountability, that trauma, no matter how deep, does not justify taking life. For them, Dorcas's calmness was not courage but collapse, a surrender to despair so complete it consumed the very meaning of mercy. In theological circles, this argument reawakens the ancient question of theodicy. How can evil exist in a world governed by divine justice? Some religious historians see in Dorcas Allen's act a perversion of the Abrahamic test, the belief that killing one's beloved might please or appease God. But in Dorcas's world, God was filtered through the lens of white supremacy, preached by those who use scripture to defend slavery. Could her mind, conditioned by sermons of obedience and damnation, have internalized a theology of hopelessness? One preacher at her trial argued precisely that. She was driven mad not by demons, but by doctrine. In that sense, religion itself becomes complicit, a moral instrument that turned faith into a form of imprisonment. Legal scholars, meanwhile, examine the contradictions her case exposed within 19th century jurisprudence. If Dorcas Allen was property, could property commit murder? And if she was a person, how could her personhood be denied in all other respects? Her trial became an early example of what would later be called a moral impossibility, the state prosecuting the very madness it had manufactured. Some letters from jurors, discovered decades later, reveal quiet ambivalence. One wrote, "We judged her as woman, yet knew her as slave. How could the two be weighed by one scale?" In this tension, Dorcas's case transcends its century. It becomes a study in the contradictions of justice itself. As the decades turned into centuries, her story began to slip from official records into folklore. In some regions of Maryland and D.C., old spiritual songs whispered of Miss Dorcas and her sleeping babes. Storytellers added supernatural flourishes, lights flickering near the riverbank. A woman's hum heard before thunderstorms, the feeling of eyes watching from behind magnolia trees. Whether these tales were born from guilt, fascination, or collective need to transform horror into myth, they ensured that Dorcas Allen would never entirely die. Memory softened her features, blurred her guilt, and turned her tragedy into moral allegory. Through myth, she achieved what life denied her: control over her narrative. In the modern era, scholars continue to wrestle with that narrative. Some literary critics read her through the framework of Gothic psychology, suggesting that America's obsession with her story reflects a deeper national unease, the guilt of a country haunted by the ghosts of its own design. Every retelling becomes an act of self-examination. How do we define evil when the system itself is corrupt? Who bears responsibility when morality collapses under oppression? Dorcas Allen becomes, in this view, not merely a historical figure but a recurring dream, an emblem of conscience unresolved. Contemporary psychologists, particularly those studying generational trauma among descendants of enslaved people, see her case as a prototype for the invisible injuries passed down through history. The emotional logic that led Dorcas to kill her children, the belief that safety is unattainable, that love itself is dangerous, mirrors patterns seen in communities scarred by systemic violence. Her story thus becomes a psychological echo chamber, reflecting how collective trauma can manifest in private catastrophe. One therapist, writing in a 2019 journal, described her as a patient history that never ended. In that haunting phrase lies the enduring relevance of her act. It is both historical and ongoing, both personal and collective. Even among artists, Dorcas Allen remains a subject of fascination. Painters depict her face half in shadow, half in light. Poets quote her final words as lamentations of lost motherhood. Playwrights stage her trial as moral theater, forcing audiences to confront the limits of empathy. Each interpretation reveals as much about the interpreter as about Dorcas herself. She functions as a moral prism. Bend the light differently, and a new color of truth emerges. And yet, beneath every layer of theory, psychological, theological, feminist, legal, remains the central enigma. Why? Why in that moment did she choose death over endurance? No archive, no doctrine, no diagnosis can answer that completely. Theories approach but never reach her interior world. Perhaps even she did not fully understand it. The act may have been both impulse and conviction, horror and mercy intertwined. Like all human paradoxes, it resists reduction. The ultimate theory, if such a thing exists, may not lie in choosing one explanation but in acknowledging the necessity of many. Dorcas Allen's story endures precisely because it refuses closure. It exposes the fragility of moral judgment when placed under the weight of dehumanization. It challenges the viewer to ask, under what conditions does love become lethal? How far can despair stretch before it becomes its own logic? These are not questions confined to the past. They remain the quiet undercurrent of human behavior whenever oppression meets desperation. As the camera of history pulls back, the echoes of her name fade into the wider hum of national memory. What began as a crime in a servant yard becomes a philosophical question, a psychological case study, a theological riddle, a cultural mirror. In this convergence, Dorcas Allen is not reduced to villain or victim. She is the unresolved center of a moral labyrinth. Every theory that seeks to explain her also indicts the world that required such explanation. Her act remains both accusation and elegy, a reminder that beneath the doctrines of justice and the comforts of faith lies a darkness that logic cannot fully illuminate. And so, each scholar, preacher, and psychologist who returns to her story ends up staring into the same abyss she once faced. The abyss between love and loss, sanity and salvation. Some turn away, others keep looking, hoping to glimpse in her silence a fragment of understanding. But perhaps the only truth worth finding is that no truth will ever be final. The question of Dorcas Allen is not meant to be answered. It is meant to be remembered. The story of Dorcas Allen defies resolution. Was she a murderer, a mother, or something that language has no name for? Her life exists only in fragments, legal transcripts, yellowed newspapers, a few abolitionist pamphlets, and the faint echoes of spirituals whispered through generations. Yet within those scattered traces something persists, a silence that speaks louder than any recorded word. It is the silence of a woman who acted in a world where action itself was forbidden, who chose when choice was never truly hers. Her legacy endures not because of what she did, but because of what her story reveals about those who witnessed it, and about us who continue to search for meaning. Each era has reconstructed her image according to its own fears and conscience. To the abolitionists, she was the embodiment of slavery's cruelty, a mother driven mad by the threat of loss. To the South, she was proof that freedom corrupts the weaker mind. To modern scholars, she is an emblem of trauma and survival, a victim of history who found agency in the only form left to her, denial of the oppressor's future. Between these interpretations lies a moral abyss. Dorcas Allen's act invites both condemnation and compassion, both horror and recognition. She stands at the intersection of love and violence, faith and despair, sanity and survival. Her hands, steady as she carried her children, blur the boundaries between deliverance and destruction, and perhaps that is why her story refuses to fade. It is not merely history, it is a reflection, a mirror turned toward every system that claims virtue while breeding despair. In that mirror we see the deeper insanity, not hers, but the society that made her choice conceivable, a nation that measured motherhood by ownership, that sanctified suffering as obedience and that taught faith through fear. If Dorcas Allen's mind fractured, it did so under the weight of laws that denied her humanity. Her silence, far from madness, may have been a final act of clarity, a refusal to let her children belong to the world that enslaved them. "They are safe now," she whispered, a statement of horror, a prayer, a verdict. Time has not absolved her, nor should it. Her story lingers because it demands discomfort. It asks how morality survives when morality itself is bound in chains. It forces us to confront the distance between judgment and understanding, between the act we condemn and the world that creates it. In her tragedy, the boundaries of guilt dissolve, leaving only the haunting truth that love can become lethal when freedom is denied. Perhaps the real question was never about Dorcas Allen at all. Perhaps it is about the world that watched her, that continues to retell her story as myth, as warning, as confession. Her name remains, trembling between memory and meaning, unresolved, unsettling, and painfully human. In that uncertainty, she still lives, and the nation she indicts still listens, uneasy beneath the weight of her silence.